My name is Jennifer, and I am 32 years old. I was sitting in a wedding planner's office with cucumber water on the table and glossy magazines about centerpieces spread in front of us, when my fiancé looked at his phone and went completely pale, like someone had pulled the power out of him. The wedding was 3 months away, $40,000 in deposits already paid, venue locked, guest list finalized, his tux fitted, my dress on its last round of alterations. Everything was done. We were supposed to be arguing about chair covers, not watching our future evaporate in real time. His phone buzzed again. He swallowed hard and said he needed the bathroom, grabbing his jacket like he was late for something. I asked if he wanted me to come with him, half joking, half confused. He said no, too fast, and was already halfway out the door. The planner and I exchanged one of those awkward smiles adults use when they sense something is wrong but don't know whose responsibility it is yet. She kept talking about uplighting. I kept watching the clock. 5 minutes, 10, 15. My phone buzzed. Can't do this, I'm so sorry. I stared at the screen, reread it, waited for another message to load that would explain what this meant. Nothing. I typed back asking what he meant. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. My chest felt tight in a way that didn't make sense yet. I'm not ready for marriage. I need time. Please don't hate me. The planner finally noticed my face. She stopped mid-sentence and asked if everything was okay. I turned my phone toward her. She went pale too, which strangely helped. At least I wasn't imagining the insanity of what was happening. Another message came in. I just can't marry you. Something inside me clicked, sharp and cold. He wasn't asking for a conversation. He wasn't panicking. He had already decided. He didn't say we needed to talk. He said he can't, past tense, like the future had already been deleted. I looked at the planner and said the words before she could stop me. Cancel the wedding, all of it. She stared at me like I was the one having a breakdown. She gently reminded me about the deposits, about the money, about how couples sometimes calm down and work things out. I told her I knew exactly how much I had paid and to cancel everything anyway. She didn't argue after that. She just started dialing. I spent the next 3 hours watching tens of thousands of dollars disappear. $15,000 to the venue, gone. $2,000 to the photographer, $5,000 to the caterer, who at least offered half back. DJ, florist, vintage car rental, even the ice sculpture guy. Every call ended the same way. Sympathy. Policy. Goodbye. By the time I walked out of that office, my wedding didn't exist anymore. Just receipts and silence. I went back to the apartment. My apartment, technically. I bought it before we met. His name was on nothing. He wasn't there. His clothes filled the closet. His shoes lined the door. His toothbrush still sat by the sink. But he was gone. I called him. Straight to voicemail. Texted asking where he was and if he was safe. Read receipt. No response. I called his best friend. She answered and immediately sounded defensive. I asked where he was. She stalled. I pushed. She hung up. I sat on the couch, surrounded by the evidence of a life that had ended without warning, trying to understand how everything could feel normal 12 hours ago and be completely destroyed now. The answer came the next morning at 7 a.m. from his sister, crying so hard she could barely breathe. She told me he was with his ex-girlfriend. She'd just finalized her divorce. They'd been talking for months. He'd been waiting. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't accept anything else yet. She told me he said he never got closure, that he made a mistake getting engaged to me, that he needed to see if things could work with her. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there understanding something that hurt more than the breakup itself. I hadn't been chosen. I had been parked. A backup plan while he waited for someone else to be available. I sent him one final text. Hope it works out with your ex. Then I blocked him everywhere. That's when the real fallout began. The calls started 3 days later, right on schedule, like some twisted appointment he'd marked on his calendar. My phone lit up with unknown numbers, one after another, so many that it looked like my phone was malfunctioning. I ignored the first few until curiosity won. When I finally answered, his voice came through someone else's phone, breathless and frantic, like he was entitled to my attention just because he could still reach me. He said we needed to talk right now, that the wedding vendors were calling him nonstop, that they wanted money and wouldn't leave him alone. I told him we had nothing to talk about. He said yes, we did, because this was getting out of control. I reminded him calmly that he left our wedding planning meeting, sent me a breakup text, and disappeared. I had canceled a wedding that no longer existed. That's how cancellations work. He said I should have waited, that we could have talked it through. I asked him what exactly I was supposed to wait for after he told me he couldn't marry me and vanished. Silence, then anger. He said he couldn't afford these bills and that I needed to help him because we were both getting married. I corrected him. I was getting married. He was waiting for his ex-girlfriend to be available. He said the venue wanted $15,000. The photographer wanted $2,000. The caterer was calling again. I told him I knew what they wanted because I'd already taken those calls. He demanded I help him pay. I said no. He said I was being cruel. I said I was being logical. He said he didn't sign up for this. I said he absolutely did when he signed the contracts and then walked out of the relationship. He said his ex-girlfriend wouldn't help. I laughed despite myself and told him that sounded like a problem between him and the woman he chose. He called again from a different number. I blocked it. Then another. Blocked. Then his sister. Blocked. His best friend. Blocked. By the time I turned my phone off, I had 38 missed calls and a pile of voicemails I didn't bother listening to. I didn't need to hear his panic to understand it. His sister texted later, asking me to please call him back because he was having a breakdown and the bills were overwhelming. I replied once and only once. He made a choice. The bills belonged to him. Then I blocked her too. It felt harsh for about 30 seconds, and then it felt clean. A mutual friend filled in the rest without me asking. Apparently, he'd been talking to his ex-girlfriend for 6 months, feeding off her promises that her marriage was over, that she regretted not choosing him, that once the divorce was final, they could finally be together. The text he got in the planner's office was from her, telling him it was official. He left our meeting to go be with her, told her he'd ended his engagement, expected to move in. Except she'd just gotten divorced. She was living in a tiny studio, paying alimony, barely scraping by. When he showed up ready to start a new life, she told him to slow down. She wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. Suddenly, the fantasy cracked. He'd blown up his life for someone who wasn't prepared to catch him. Meanwhile, the vendors were calling him directly, because when we booked everything, he insisted on being the primary contact. His name, his email, his phone. It made sense at the time. He wanted control. I paid. Now control came with consequences. He made about $30,000 a year teaching yoga part-time. He lived rent-free in my apartment. I'd covered groceries, utilities, most of our trips. He had some savings, but nowhere near enough to handle cancellation fees stacking into the tens of thousands. About a week in, his mother showed up at my apartment and rang the doorbell so many times I thought she might break it. I answered through the camera. She demanded we talk about the situation. I told her there was nothing to discuss. She said the vendor bills should be split 50-50 because we were both getting married. I corrected her. I was getting married. Her son was killing time until his ex-girlfriend was free. She called it a mistake. I called it a choice. She said people make mistakes. I said people pay for the mistakes they choose. She accused me of being vindictive. I said I was being fair. She said her son's credit would be ruined. I said then he should pay the bills. She asked with what money. I said not my problem. She stood outside yelling through the camera until I told her I'd call the police for trespassing. She left screaming about lawyers. A few days later, I got a letter from a lawyer demanding I pay half the cancellation fees as the other party to the wedding. I took it to my own lawyer, who read it once and laughed out loud. He told me it was nonsense. The vendors were pursuing the person who signed the contracts and caused the cancellation by ending the relationship. There was no legal obligation for me to rescue my ex from the consequences of abandoning our engagement. That felt like the first real exhale I'd had in days. At the grocery store the following week, his best friend cornered me in the cereal aisle. She told me he was suffering, that he was working double shifts trying to pay off the bills. I said that sounded exhausting. She asked if I didn't care. I told her I used to. She said I loved him. I told her I loved the man I thought he was, not the one who left me for someone else. She said it hadn't even worked out with the ex-girlfriend. I stopped pushing my cart and asked her to repeat that. Apparently, the ex-girlfriend dumped him about a week after he left me, saying she wasn't ready for a relationship and needed space. I laughed, a real laugh, right there between the cereal boxes. His friend started crying, saying he'd given up everything for her. I told her so had I, and walked away. By the time I got home, I realized something important. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about him wanting me to clean up the mess he made when his plan failed, and I wasn't going to do it. Things escalated fast after that grocery store encounter. Like once the illusion cracked, everyone involved started scrambling to rewrite the story in real time. His father called me that evening, voice deep and authoritative, trying to sound like a man who still had leverage. He said we needed to discuss my obligations, that I had a moral responsibility to help his son because we were engaged, and love doesn't just disappear overnight. I told him I wasn't his daughter-in-law anymore and I didn't have obligations to someone who walked out on me mid-wedding planning to chase his ex-girlfriend. He said the vendors were harassing his son, threatening legal action. I told him then his son should pay the bills he agreed to. He said his son didn't have that kind of money. I told him that should have been part of the calculation before leaving. He accused me of financial abuse. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the accusation was so detached from reality it bordered on satire. Financial abuse would have been draining accounts or sabotaging his ability to work. All I did was cancel a wedding after being abandoned. He warned me I'd regret being so heartless. I warned him that continued harassment would get documented and answered with a restraining order. He hung up on me, furious, and blocked me everywhere, which honestly felt like a gift. The mutual friends started picking sides then, the way they always do when a story has a villain-shaped vacancy. A few quietly unfriended me. Others sent vague messages about forgiveness and grace, about being the bigger person. The ones who actually knew what happened stuck around. Quality over quantity became more than a slogan. It became a filter. Then his ex-girlfriend called me. I didn't expect that. I answered out of sheer curiosity. She sounded exhausted, defensive, already rehearsed. She said she felt bad about how everything went down, that she never meant for things to spiral like this. I told her calmly that I wasn't interested in absolution from someone who knowingly participated in 6 months of emotional cheating. She tried to reframe it, saying he was confused, that he told her the engagement was a mistake, that he felt trapped. I reminded her that trapped men don't plan weddings for 3 years and then leave only when a different option becomes available. She asked if I could help with the bills, so he'd stop calling her. I told her she should stop answering his calls if she didn't want to deal with him. Silence followed. Then she hung up. A week later, his sister showed up at my work. Security called me down, clearly uncomfortable. She was in the lobby crying, mascara streaked, telling anyone who would listen that her brother's life was falling apart and I was letting it happen. I told security I didn't want to see her. She started shouting that I was ruining him, that 2 vendors had already sent his accounts to collections, that his credit score had dropped hundreds of points. She said he couldn't rent an apartment and was crashing on couches. I asked her what she thought would have happened if I had married him and he'd done this later. She had no answer. She begged me to help, said he wanted to apologize, said he knew he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I told her apologies don't come with invoices attached. Security escorted her out while she screamed about karma and how I'd get what I deserved. I went back upstairs and finished my meeting. The handwritten letter arrived a few days later, 3 pages of cramped apologies and revisionist history. He wrote about manipulation, about how his ex-girlfriend messed with his head, how he panicked, how when her divorce finalized and he left me, reality hit fast. He wrote that she dumped him within a week, that he begged her to reconsider, that she blocked him. He wrote that he was drowning in debt, that his family was furious, that his life was ruined. He asked if I could please help with the vendor bills, promising he'd pay me back eventually. He said losing me was the biggest regret of his life. I read it twice. Then I wrote back 1 sentence. You made your choice. Live with it. I didn't sign it. I didn't add anything else. I mailed it and blocked the return address. That's when everything collapsed for him all at once. He filed for bankruptcy within the month. Most of the vendors went to collections. His credit tanked. His yoga studio cut his hours. His parents stopped answering his calls because they were tired of bailing him out. The ex-girlfriend moved across the country and got engaged to someone else within the year. When he found out, according to mutual friends, he had a complete breakdown, realized he'd burned his entire life down for someone who never intended to build one with him. People expected me to feel bad. I didn't. I felt finished. The noise eventually died down, not all at once, but in layers, like a storm moving farther offshore. The calls stopped first, then the letters. Then the third-hand updates from mutual friends who had nothing new to report except that he was still struggling and still blaming anyone who would listen. I didn't celebrate his collapse. I didn't mourn it either. I felt something quieter than either of those emotions, a settling, like my life had finally landed back inside its own outline. Therapy helped in ways I didn't expect. Not because it made me forgive him, but because it helped me forgive myself for ignoring the red flags that now felt obvious in hindsight. The 6 months of secrecy, the way he insisted on being the primary contact for the wedding while I handled the payments, the habit of framing big decisions as temporary until something better came along. I learned how easily love can turn into accommodation, and how accommodation, left unchecked, becomes self-erasure. The money part stung more than I admitted out loud. I lost around $10,000 in non-refundable deposits. It wasn't devastating, but it was enough to feel. Enough to remind me that consequences don't always belong to the person who makes the mess. Still, it could have been worse. I could have married him. I could have found out after vows and photos and legal entanglements. I could have been untangling a divorce instead of a cancellation. That perspective carried me through the days when anger tried to sneak back in. I sold the engagement ring for a little over half of what I paid for it, and used the money to take a trip I'd always postponed. Nothing glamorous, just space, long walks, silence, time to let my nervous system recalibrate. I came back lighter, not because I was healed, but because I wasn't carrying a lie anymore. He tried one last angle through his parents. His mother emailed me a rambling message about forgiveness and family values and how real love shows up when things get hard. I replied once, clearly and without emotion. He left our family before it existed. Then I blocked her. His father threatened to sue me for emotional damages. My lawyer sent a single response citing lack of standing and harassment. I never heard from him again. Social circles shifted. A few people who bought the version of the story where I was cruel and heartless drifted away. Others came back later with quiet apologies once the truth spread and the timeline stopped making sense. I didn't reopen doors out of guilt. I let the people who stayed earn their place by staying. Dating took time. When I started again, it was slow and careful, with boundaries I hadn't known how to set before. Trust didn't come back all at once, but it came back enough. I learned to listen when my body tensed, when something felt rushed or conditional. I learned that love doesn't ask you to be a backup plan. Every so often, someone would suggest I should have helped him, just to be kind, just to end the drama. I always answered the same way. Being the bigger person doesn't mean being the cleaner of someone else's calculated mess. He didn't make a mistake. He made a plan, waited 6 months for his ex to be available, and left the moment she was. When the plan failed, he wanted me to be the safety net he'd already cut loose. That wasn't kindness. That was enabling. Last I heard, he was still rebuilding, still teaching classes, still renting rooms, still explaining away what happened with stories that made him sound less responsible. I wish him no harm. I also wish him no rescue. Both can be true. It's been almost a year now. My finances are stable. My apartment feels like mine again. The future no longer feels like something I'm bracing for. I didn't win anything. I just stopped losing myself to someone else's choices. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple and uncomfortable. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're acknowledgments of reality. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to let someone live with the consequences they worked so hard to create.